Welcome, Gunrunner.
First unveiled at the June 1994 Consumer Electronics Show and launched in North America on the 21st of November 1994, with other regions following in the next 2 months, the Sega 32X was a rather unique add-on that turned your 16-bit Sega Mega Drive or Genesis into a state-of-the-art 32-bit beast, capable of displaying texture-mapped 3D graphics, booming out stereo surround sound, and could even be combined with your Mega CD2 for even more processing power. However, the reception to the device was rather mixed, with some people seeing it as rather pointless due to the Sega Saturn being just around the corner, whilst others appreciated the ability to upgrade their existing console to a next-gen machine without losing their already vast games collection. Unfortunately, the 32X was a dismal failure, probably the worst move that Sega ever made, and certainly the start of their rapid decline that culminated in them exiting the hardware business completely after the failure of the Dreamcast. The mushroom-shaped add-on was discontinued less than 2 years after launch, with Sega being widely ridiculed for even coming up with the idea in the first place, with it being pointed out that the choice to release the 32X had had a detrimental effect on the success of the Sega Saturn. Even in the present day, where most people now look quite favourably upon other rivals of the era like the Atari Jaguar and 3DO, the 32X is still much maligned, so hopefully this video will explain why that's the case and paint the expansion in a new light. You, my viewers, were certainly keen to see me cover the 32X, despite its distinct lack of attention from retro gaming fans in general, with it comfortably winning my recent poll to decide my next Amazing Facts video, with the NEC Super Graphics in a very distant second place. So hopefully I've done the 32X justice, and I look forward to seeing what you all think down in the comments. Now with all that out of the way, it's time to get on with the show as I proudly present 10 amazing Sega 32X facts.
Since the beginning of time, mankind has striven to double and redouble his powers.
A mysterious machine has appeared in homes across America.
All right, baby.
Increase the power of the unit 40 times.
32X.
Welcome to the next lesson.
You spill your drink?
I don't have a drink.
Uh-oh.
A lot of people wonder why Sega even considered making something like the 32X and didn't just skip forward to the Saturn. It just seemed like such a waste of time and money, not to mention resources, to the gaming masses. Most people just assumed it was a vain attempt to prolong the success of the hugely successful Mega Drive and Genesis in the face of new rivals. Well, the last part of that is partly right, but the real reason for the 32X is probably even more baffling when looked at with modern eyes, as the add-on was actually developed in response to the announcement of the Atari Jaguar. Now I know what you're saying, why did Sega care about a failed console? But you have to remember that in the summer of 1993, when the Jaguar was first shown to the press, it wasn't failed. In fact, there was some pretty big hype surrounding it, especially when people saw the first screenshots of Alien vs Predator. And you have to remember that Atari was still a pretty big name in the industry in 1993, with the capacity to make a big dent in Sega's market share, especially in Europe, and that's what the company was afraid of. Indeed, during the Winter CES show in January 1994, just after the Jaguar's launch, Sega of America Research and Development Head Joe Miller took a phone call in his Las Vegas hotel suite from Sega President Hayao Nakayama, in which Nakayama stressed the importance of coming up with a quick response to the Jaguar. Included on this call were Sega of America producer Scott Bayless, Sega hardware team head Hideki Sato, and Sega of America Vice President of Technology Marty Franz. The idea, mooted by the Japanese team, referred to by former Sega of America producer Michael Latham as Genesis 2, was an entirely new independent console. This would have been a new Genesis model with an upgraded colour palette and some limited 3D capabilities thanks to the integration of the SVP chip that had previously been used in the Mega Drive version of Virtua Racing. According to Latham, Miller dismissed the vision of an upgraded Genesis as a horrible idea, and added, if all you're going to do is enhance the system, you should make it an add-on. If it's a new system with legitimate new software, then great, but if the only thing it does is double the colours, then it's rather pointless. Miller said his idea was to leverage the existing Genesis as a way to stop them from alienating Sega customers, who would otherwise be required to discard their Genesis systems entirely to play 32-bit games, and to control the cost of the new system in the form of an add-on. From these discussions, the new add-on, codenamed Project Mars, was green-lit. However, despite offering some assistance with the project, Sega Enterprises were never fully behind the idea, feeling that all resources should be diverted into getting the Saturn to market earlier. However, Sega America knew that there was no way the Saturn would be out in time to fight the Jaguar and wanted to push forward with the 32X. I suppose you could argue that in a strange way, when looked at it from this context, the 32X was somewhat of a success, given it sold over 3 times as many units as the Atari console it was created to compete with. This next entry leads on directly from the last, which you might have noticed that in that final paragraph I specifically talked about Sega of America and their battles with Sega Enterprises over in Japan. As I mentioned, the 32X was very much their doing, and their Japanese parents were very much against the idea, wanting them to hold out for the Saturn and divert all their resources into making it a success. But there were already a lot of tensions within Sega, stemming from the success of the Sega Genesis in North America. Sega Enterprises were jealous of the success of their American branch, having seen the Mega Drive lose out to both the PC Engine and Super Famicom in their homeland, and this is one of the main reasons they removed former Sega of America president Michael Katz from his post, despite him doing a very impressive job that set up all the groundwork for Tom Kalinske to come in and succeed after him. In fact, this relationship had become so fractured that Sega of Japan said they weren't even going to release the 32X in their homeland, but later had a change of heart and launched it just a month later in December 1994, although they put very little effort into promoting it. In fact, speaking of Tom Kalinske, he had previously talked about the disagreements between the two main Sega offices in an interview where he stated, "Initially, the argument was that we could get another year of life out of the Genesis before we had to introduce the Saturn. Japan disagreed with me on that, so as a kind of stopgap measure, the 32X came up." He didn't really see the 32X as a mistake as such, but his former engineer Scott Bayliss very much regrets his part in the debacle and wishes that Japan had got their way, stating in a more recent interview that the 32X just made us look greedy and dumb to consumers. History very much proves him right. It's fair to say that so far in this video I've painted a pretty negative picture of the 32X that makes it seem like it was a total disaster from day one. There are actually a few glimmers of positivity in the 32X story if you look closely enough, with this next tidbit of trivia being one of them. You see, although the 32X only sold 800,000 units worldwide, with about a quarter of those being sold when the unit was on clearance, the early initial sales for the 32X were actually pretty good, and the demand for the add-on was even more impressive still. In fact, leading up to Christmas 1994, Sega announced that they had received orders for around 1 million units. However, due to serious supply issues with the Hitachi SH2 processors, which wasn't helped by the Saturn needing the exact same chips, Sega had only shipped around half of that amount by the end of January, totally failing to capitalise on that demand, causing eager parents to look elsewhere that Christmas. Europe and the UK in particular had also seen huge demand for the 32X, but suppliers to that region were even more restricted, causing a lot of friction with European retailers. Sadly for Sega, that demand dropped off a cliff once 1995 came around, mostly due to the impending launch of the Saturn and PlayStation, but it didn't help that consumers were losing faith in Sega, partly due to the aforementioned supply issues, but also because of the low trickle of 32X games, with little to entice those potential customers. You do have to wonder how different things could have been if Sega had been able to meet that early demand. And speaking of that slow trickle of games, this is a point that needs expanding on further I feel, as it was a key reason for the 32X's failure. with Sega very much splitting their own resources, with their top programmers now working on games for 3 different formats of the Mega Drive, Saturn and 32X, the company was hoping that third-party publishers would help pick up the slack, especially as they'd been responsible for such a huge part of the Mega Drive's success before it. Unfortunately, this didn't really work out as Sega had hoped, with only 7 third-party publishers ever releasing games for the 32X, in the form of Activision, Electronic Arts, Acclaim, Interplay, Time Warner Interactive, Game Tech and Digital Pictures. And of those 7, only 3 companies released more than one game. With Sega titles included, this left just 40 different 32X games released, including regional exclusives and 32X CD games. To put this in context, even the console the 32X was designed to compete with, the equally game-starved Atari Jaguar, had more releases. To compound matters further, I think most people would struggle to name a handful of 32X must-haves, making the add-on even less appealing. Now I must start by saying yes, I did cover the Neptune in my recent cancelled Sega consoles video, and I've also made a standalone video on the console too, but it would be very remiss of me not to mention the unreleased 32X based home console, not just because of its importance and relevance to the subject of this particular video, but also because it's been in the news just recently after somebody built their very own Neptune console using a 3D printer and some very clever modding of a Sega Mega Drive 2 motherboard. As I've already mentioned, the Neptune was an all-in-one console from 1994 that combined the then aging 16-bit Mega Drive hardware with the newly released 32-bit Sega 32X add-on. Many people at the time moaned intensely about having to buy separate units to get the full 32-bit experience, and the rather complicated way you had to connect the mushroom-shaped unit up to your console too. So the all-in-one Neptune was very much the perfect response from Sega, who also helped that people would see it as a lower cost alternative to the soon to be released Saturn for people who didn't yet want to replace their existing Mega Drive collections. This new 32-bit hybrid system was shown to the press on numerous occasions, and a small run of prototype systems were also produced to impress retailers and developers. That's how close it was to being released. Sales of the 32X have been far lower than Sega's expectations, causing the company to think twice about expanding their product range further. It wasn't just the poor sales of the 32X that killed the Neptune though, it was also the cost of building these new systems. It has been reported that it would have ended up retailing for about $50 less than the Saturn, not a big enough amount to qualify it as a budget option as Sega originally intended. Sega delayed the release of the Neptune several times before quietly cancelling it completely during the excitement around the launch of the Saturn, hoping nobody would notice, and they were right. By this point, nobody really cared about the Neptune, and it wasn't until the modern day that the many what-ifs started. Two of the very first games announced for the Sega 32X add-on were arcade-perfect conversions of 2 hugely popular super-scale arcade games in Afterburner and Space Harrier, with the promise that more such games would follow, including the likes of Outrun, Power Drift and Galaxy Force 2. Sega hoped that finally being able to play perfect ports of some of their most popular and indeed technologically advanced coin-ops in the home would be a big draw. However, they severely misjudged the market with this decision, as by 1994 people no longer cared about old arcade games from the mid to late 80s and were looking towards the new emerging 3D polygon pushers like Daytona USA and Ridge Racer. Those superscaler games were the ones people wanted when the Mega CD arrived, but Sega made another bad call with that add-on too, preferring to concentrate on releasing rubbish FMV games, only ever delivering a CD-based port of one superscaler game in the form of Afterburner 3. The incredibly lukewarm reception to the $60 ports of crusty old arcade games made Sega change their strategy, causing them to try and rush versions of games like Doom, Star Wars Arcade and Virtua Racing to market for the 32X launch. They then quietly put out Space Harrier and Afterburner a month or so later. Interestingly, the proposed 32X versions of Outrun, Power Drift and Galaxy Force 2 did eventually appear, but converted for play on the Saturn instead of the Magic Mushroom. Perhaps one of the most baffling announcements from Sega when it came to the 32X was that they would be releasing a range of games that required both the Mushroom as well as Sega's previous Mega Drive add-on, the Mega CD. Given that both the 32X and Mega CD had hardly set the world alight sales-wise, meaning the amount of people who owned both was even smaller, it just seemed so strange to waste more money and resources on producing games for them. In total, just 5 titles were released for the 32X CD combo: Supreme Warrior, Slam City, Corpse Killer, Fahrenheit, and a greatly enhanced version of Night Trap. None of these titles were massively impressive, but at least they showed that the Mega CD could now do proper full motion video without all the grainy pixels and colour limiting. It would be quite interesting to see what this add-on combination could do if it was really pushed to its limits. One reason for pushing this format is that Sega did intend to create a second version of the Neptune console that featured a CD drive. I talked about this also unreleased system in my cancelled Sega consoles video, so if you want to know more then check that out. I've put a link to it down in the description as always. With so many different models of the Sega Mega Drive out there, it's really no surprise to learn that the 32X doesn't work with all of them. Of course, when the initial design was drawn up, Sega only had the original models of the console to worry about, not any later editions that might come along. So what are these compatibility issues then, and where will you come across them? Well, let's start with the Genesis 3, which was a vastly cost-reduced console that was released by Majesco Entertainment in 1998 under license from Sega, which when combined with the removal of the expansion port meant that it wasn't 32X compatible. This of course meant that it wasn't compatible with the Mega CD, Mega Modem or power-based converter either. Then we have the later models produced by Tector in Brazil. From their very own Mega Drive 3 onwards, the hardware used emulation and lacked even a cartridge port, making the plug-in impossible. You'll also find that the 32X won't work with the more modern at-games versions of the Mega Drive either, for the same reasons as the Genesis 3. Unbelievably though, it is actually possible to use the 32X with the Sega Nomad handheld, albeit after a fair bit of modding and soldering, but it is possible. There's also a very long-winded and rather complicated workaround that allows you to use the 32X with the recently released Analog SG2, if you really wanted to take advantage of that lovely HDMI output. I'm sure you've already got a pretty good idea of the 32X by now and what it did and didn't have to offer. And this entry in the list is all about the latter of those, what we all missed out on, and more specifically, its unreleased games. I already spoke about the plan to release more superscaler games and how that wasn't what people wanted, so now I'll tell you how Sega tried to change the picture and offer something more exciting. I think the biggest announcement was the 32X port of Daytona USA. This was widely publicised across the press of the time, but strangely never shown in any shape or form, so it's unclear if this was ever worked on. But given how poorly the original Sega Saturn version of the game turned out, the company were probably right to cancel it. And there were a few more games that were briefly announced for the 32X by Sega, only to appear on the Saturn a bit later, including the likes of Panzer Dragoon, another game I think was way beyond the 32X hardware, Bug and Amok. Perhaps the most interesting ones announced by Sega, however, were a port of their own Wing War arcade game, as this never appeared on the Saturn in any shape or form, and a third Echo the Dolphin game, which we know almost nothing about. When it comes to unreleased third-party games, the list is even bigger, which is understandable given just how few non-Sega games made it to the add-on, as I mentioned earlier. The top picks in this category are Alien Trilogy, Batman Forever, Spider-Man vs Venom, Street Fighter the Movie and Judge Dredd from Acclaim, Street Racer and Rayman from Ubisoft, Mission Impossible and Waterworld from Ocean and Die Hard Trilogy from Fox Interactive. Core Design, who brought BC Racers to the 32X, also planned a huge amount of titles for the add-on too, including the likes of Soulstar X, Swagman, Bland Machine Head, Virtual Golf and Thunderhawk 2, but most of these did end up appearing on the Saturn. I really wanted to end this video with something more positive, and it really doesn't get more positive than the amazing homebrew port of Tomb Raider for the 32X, a game that was briefly planned for release on the add-on before Core Design moved development over to the Saturn. The background to this port is really interesting and involves a very talented coder known as Xproga, who back in January 2022 released an open source version of the Tomb Raider engine known as OpenLara. It was initially aimed at ARM processors and was used to develop an incredibly impressive Game Boy Advance version of the game, with a 32X conversion following. From here, people found ways to adapt OpenLara to work with other chip architectures, which resulted in ports to the Atari Jaguar and, of course, the Sega 32X add-on. This new port was announced in just the last month and is being handled by the original developer of the OpenLara engine, Xproga. As you can see from the video here, it's already showing remarkable progress, looking nearly as good as the Saturn original. So far, the prototype only has one level you can move around and runs at around 15 to 20 frames per second. There's still a lot of work to do on 32X Tomb Raider, but even in its current state it shows just how much can be done with the add-on when you put it in the right hands, and I'll certainly be keeping an eye on this to see how it progresses.
Welcome to the next level.
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing Sega 32X facts. But which one of these fabulous facts was your favourite, or can you think of any other tantalising tidbits and trivia that I didn't include? I always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comment section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons and YouTube backers in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Paul Daniel, Mins, Dos Gamerman, Luke MC, Carl Olsen, Seth Robinson, Grady Haynes, Mark Strickland, Kalimatorn, Trogdor the Burninator, Daniel Skoronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tammy Kitsune, Alan J. Dodds, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to host extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights, and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.